We're going to be discussing the fine art of communication. And what's going to be interesting about this one is not only does the error come from a suspect that unfortunately we're going to be hearing a lot more of when we're discussing logical fallacies, but we again want to remind you and make sure that as we're discussing these errors in communication, it's not intended for the purpose of pointing the finger at those silly atheists who think they're philosophers when they're actually, well, even and biologists, but the point being made is this. The goal is for us to be equipped in proper communication. So when we're discussing this, understand it's not to demean or defame the individual who made the error. He does that fine on his own. We want to equip you to avoid making the same mistake by recognizing it and understanding it as just that. Now, Peter, could you give us an overview of what was said and the type of error that was said as we begin this topic of rhetoric this week?
Yeah. So on Thursdays, like you said, Sean, we're going over rhetoric, which is specifically it's the art of public speaking, but we're kind of refining it down to just communication in general, because the entirety of this show is built around equipping people to be able to express their faith to people who are skeptical about it in a way that's cohesive, in a way that can minister to them and speak to them. For as Aristotle, who was the one that literally wrote the book on rhetoric, said, it's not enough to know what to say, you also need to know how to say it, right? And this is something that we see throughout the scriptures where Jesus encourages his followers to have their words be grace seasoned with salt, right? It's not just enough to say the right thing. There is a methodology or a means of expression that's, again, logically cohesive and something that is convincing, something that could actually convince someone in a real way out of their false belief system. So today we're going to be looking at false equivalency. This is an interesting one because, again, the last couple we've been going over are ones that, in order to make them, they have to be kind of intentional. This one is, you can make this one accidentally very easily, actually. So what you're trying to do in this fallacy, and again, I don't believe that he is, Richard Dawkins, who wrote this particular article that we're about to pick on, I don't think he was intentionally trying to commit this fallacy, but he did, right? So this is where, in an attempt to disprove your opponent's point, you bring up something that is equivalent in order to say, like, well, you see, it doesn't work here, so therefore it doesn't work with you either, right? So I'm going to make an analogy. I'm going to equate them to your point. I'm going to tear down the analogy and therefore tear down your point.
Which is not necessarily a straw man. It's a misunderstanding of an illustration. That's different.
Exactly. So this is, by the way, that actually can be an effective way of communicating with someone. So if you can find an actual comparable analogy to what someone is bringing up, and then you can show how these things are the same. So you're taking like an abstract, high-level philosophical concept, and you're using a lower-level illustration, showing how they're similar, and then showing how the easier to understand one is actually false. You are simultaneously disproving their argument as a whole.
It would be like Jesus using the parables to illustrate his points. The explanation is after the definition, of course. That's the fundamentals of communication. But we want to make sure that the parable actually does match the story or point we're trying to tell.
Exactly. So a false equivalency is the story doesn't match, right? There's problems with it. It doesn't line up on a lot of levels, and therefore it's not analogous, and therefore by disproving it, it is like a false man fallacy, a straw man fallacy, where you're actually not disproving the person's point at all. So if that sounds a little too abstract for you, well, let me give you an actual example of false equivalency, courtesy of Richard Dawkins. He wrote this article a couple weeks ago, and it is about two pro-choice people to help them argue better with pro-lifers. Now, some things that he does very well in this article is he actually does explain our position, right? So he is trying to explain to his pro-choice cohorts, hey, you're never going to convince a pro-lifer that what you're doing is moral by saying that a woman has autonomy over her body, because they genuinely believe that you are murdering a child. And he's like, and you can't really compare the freedom and autonomy of one person over the life of another person. And so he does actually a pretty good job of that. But then he gets into his error. So he quotes from a Catholic website, which is interesting. And the Catholic article that he quotes from actually does give a very good biological grounding for why we are pro-life. So I'm just going to read the Catholic article because I think it's good, and it does sum up our point very nicely. From the time that the ovum is fertilized, a new life is begun, which is neither that of the father nor of the mother. It is rather the life of a new human being with its own growth. It would never be made human if it were not human already. To this perpetual evidence, modern genetic science brings valuable confirmation. It has demonstrated that from the first instant, the program is fixed as to what this living being will be, a man. This individual man, with his characteristics, aspects already well determined, right from fertilization, is begun the adventure of a human life. So, again, kudos to Richard Dawkins for actually finding a quote and not finding a straw man quote. He found a good quote that sums up the pro-life position. How does he attack it? And so he quotes from the article, "It would never be made human if we're not human already." So he's right. That is the major sentence within that article. Now, how is he going to defeat that? Seriously? Does that mean that an acorn is an oak tree? Does that mean that the whispering embryonic zephyr out of the Atlantic is synonymous with a hurricane that later flattens a town in Florida? Okay, so there's the false equivalency. You have something small that eventually perpetuates itself into something large. And he's saying, are they the same thing? So is an acorn synonymous with an oak tree? Is a small wind, he uses a lot of fancy lingo, but it is a small wind.
English translator over here.
Is a small wind that eventually manifests itself inside of a hurricane or a typhoon on the other side of the world. Are they the same thing? Now, is that really a good equivocation to make for our argument?
No, because when we're talking about either potential life or the status of life, our argument is that could one day be a person, just like I could one day be an old man. It doesn't make me, and this is what he'll go on to essentially stumble himself over, the assumption that potential life is the only thing we're arguing. The article that he himself quoted was very careful to specify it's not the potential life, it's the genetic endowment that makes that fully, in its fertilized state, a human being. That it's not only going to continue to develop into a man, but that it is presently everything genetically that I am as a man.
That's right. So he's misconstruing stages of development for species classification. Right.
So, to his credit, a zephyr is in fact composed of the same nature as the hurricane in that they're both wind, but our argument isn't that a zephyr is a hurricane. Right. The argument is we're talking about wind here, a human life.
Right. So, what we could say to that is is an is an acorn the same as an oak tree? No, but an oak seed, which is an acorn, is an oak in species. And if you develop that oak seed past a certain point, it becomes an oak tree. In the same way, is the embryo an adult? No, that's stages of development, right? An embryo is a particular stage of human development, but it is a human being. It is a human embryo that develops into a human child, that develops into a human adolescent, that develops into a human adult, that develops into a human geriatric eventually, if they are lucky. So that's the idea that's the mistake that he made, false equivalency. So did you have any examples from the scripture of false equivalency before we could sum up a way of answering a false equivalency?
Yeah, again, we want to make sure that this Bible question and answer program has the Bible first and foremost as our standard. And in your favorite book, the book of Jeremiah, as well as in Ezekiel, there's a proverb that's going around in Israel at the time. I'll take Ezekiel in case you want to give the cross-examination. But they're essentially saying that our parents have sinned and now we're facing the consequences. They illustrate this, they equivocate it with the idea of our parents eating sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. The modern equivalent would be you ate the sour candy and now we're the ones with puckered lips. It's that kind of mindset. Now, apart from this telepathy of taste, God's also addressing the nature of the proverb not as, well, that's not accurate, your taste buds don't carry over. He's addressing the point of moral accountability. He says in Ezekiel 18 and verse 4, or verse 3, let's start. As I live, says the Lord God, you shall no longer use this proverb in Israel. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins shall die. But if a man is just and does what is lawful and right, if he has not eaten on the mountains, nor lifted up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, nor defiled his neighbor's wife, nor approached a woman during her impurity. Goes on and notes these examples of idolatry that was being practiced in Israel that they were being held accountable for at that time. He says, yeah, your parents did something. That's part of the consequences, but you're doing something. That's why you're also sharing in the consequences. The false equivocation was this mistake, is assuming we're only sinning, or we're only seeing judgment rather, because our parents sinned. And God's point is, you're sinning too, son, and you're being held accountable for it.
Yeah, and so in that answer, we do get a good methodology in answering the false equivocation. So you have to call it out, you have to explain why it's not analogous, and sometimes you get a little fancy, and God kind of does it there, where you can show how actually, if I were to take your analogy, I could show you why you're so wrong, right? So in other words, when God talks about parents eating and the children's teeth being set on edge, he's like, okay, well, let's just take that seriously. Is that true? Right? If your parents ate something sour, is your palate changed? Well, no. If your parents do something sinful, am I going to judge them for it? Yes. But the only reason why your teeth are going to be set on edge is if you eat something sour. And the only reason why I'm going to judge you is if you do something evil or wicked.
Which is why it goes on in the rest of the chapter to give examples of these things and them realizing, oh no, I'm doing that.
That's right. And so similarly, what me and you did earlier on when I said, okay, well, actually, an oak seed is an acorn, and an acorn is of the species of oak. So I could actually say, okay, if I'm going to use your analogy of is an acorn an oak tree, I could say, well, it's not an oak tree, but it is an oak, right? I'm not going to take an acorn, plant it in the ground, and get an apple tree. I'm not going to get a pear tree. I'm going to get an oak tree, right? It, to its nature, to its species, it is of the species of oak, and it's living. Therefore, this is why you can sell seeds for money, right? You're not selling inappropriate material. You're selling something that is living, that could be planted and that could be grown into a very specific species, right? So it has value to it. Now, what we're arguing is that human life has unique value that is above everything else. So he makes the argument of later on of like, well, like if that's your measurement, then is it more wrong to like torture a fully grown cow or a non-conscious embryo? And the idea is like, well, you're assuming that you're actually assuming our position is your position, right? His position is that we only value human life because of personhood, and personhood is evaluated through things like consciousness and capability. We're saying, no, human life is inherently valuable whether or not it has these qualities, right? A coma patient is still a human being. Is it more morally justified to torture a coma patient versus a conscious person? They're both humans. Don't torture a human being, right?
Especially if you can measure brain activity. That's the point.
Exactly.
And again, Richard Dawkins, to his credit, he's not a fool. He's an Oxford-educated biologist. What puts him in these positions is that he keeps pretending he's a philosopher. Right. It would be just as meaningful as if I started spending all my time talking about things I don't actually know anything about. I'm not a movie critic. I don't know the composition of the English story and the focus of narrative. I can tell when I like or don't like a movie, but if I took time in this program to explain things I actually don't know, you're all going to be able to spot it, and much like with Professor Dawkins, it's going to make us ending up look silly. So when he ends up on the philosophy chair, when he is trained in the biology chair, what ends up happening? He would then, hopefully at least, we can attribute benevolence to him in this case. You were to specify, as a biologist, he would understand, we're not arguing stage, we're arguing species. Is the zygote, in fact, the same species, like you were arguing with the oak, in the human genus? And that's the whole point. So when we're talking about these issues, again, just for the sake of those listening and going on to our questions, what are the things they need to keep in mind when not only recognizing but responding to these things?
Yes, first of all, if you are going to use the illustration, make sure that it actually equates. Right? So be very careful when you're using illustrations. Make sure that it matters, it coheres at the point where it needs to cohere, so that you're actually illustrating something to someone as opposed to just setting up a false equivalency. And be on watch, be listening when you hear certain things like this, because once again, you have to prove the equivalency. So if someone gives argumentation like this, you have to be very watchful of where does the analogy miss and how can I help this person see where the analogy misses, and then put a better scenario in mind so that we can get to the real nut of the issue. Because once again, if you are in we're assuming in these rhetoric classes that you are talking to someone who is arguing with you in good faith, right? There's a bona fide kind of, hey, we're both just trying to get to the truth. We're both just arguing. We have our points, and we might be very passionate about it, but we ultimately want to know what the truth is, right? So once these particular types of logical fallacies come up, it doesn't mean necessarily that you're arguing with someone in bad faith, but once you call them on it, if they're unwilling to let go, that would be a good indicator that they're not willing to actually get to the truth. They just want to assert their point. So you could do it very gently. You could say, hey, this is not a very good analogy. Maybe pick another one. Maybe I can think of a better one for you, but try to help them see why it doesn't equivocate, and then you can move on in the conversation to hopefully more fruitful area.
All right. So thank you all for joining us in our rhetoric lesson for this week, and we'll look forward to next week. We'll be discussing more, hopefully with even more practical opportunities to be included. But make sure that when you're doing this, again, you match the illustration, the bad illustration, with the good one. You don't attribute motive, another fallacy, but you establish the fact that, well, let me just clarify why this doesn't fit in my way of thinking, and then we can hopefully both understand each other more. That's the goal of communication.